Instantly establishing central dominion, this opener carves out a commanding presence, ready to dictate the flow of the early game. Developing this knight immediately challenges central control and prepares for rapid piece activity, setting a dynamic tone. Asserting central space, white immediately challenges black's knight and opens diagonals for queen and bishop. Embracing the fianchetto signals a solid, hypermodern approach, aiming to control the center from afar and prepare for a swift kingside castling. Building a strong central pawn structure and preparing to fianchetto the king's bishop is a solid plan, aiming for long-term positional advantage. Developing the bishop to its longest diagonal instantly challenges white's central control and prepares for castling. Seizing the center's heart dramatically escalates the pawn war and claims vital central space. Solidifying the center, this pawn advance prepares to challenge white's central grip and opens diagonals for the bishops. Solidifying the center's pawn structure, white aims to build a robust kingside defense and potentially prepare a kingside attack later on. Prioritizing king safety, black tucks their monarch away behind a developing pawn shield, preparing for central engagement. Securing the center's pawn chain while preparing to challenge the kingside with a potential kingside pawn storm. This piece repositions for active participation and eyes the crucial dark squares. Developing the knight to d7 offers solid support for the central pawn push and aims to bring the piece into the game, potentially swinging over to f6 to defend the king or even towards c5 to challenge white's knight. Developing the queen to d2 unifies the rooks, preparing for a potential kingside attack by clearing the d-file for a rook and supporting the e4 pawn's advance, while also offering defensive coverage for the king's flank should lines open unexpectedly. Instantly confronting the pawn center, black aims to destabilize white's central grip and gain queenside space, potentially opening lines for his pieces and creating dynamic counterplay. Developing the knight to this square prepares to contest the center, potentially supporting a pawn push or reinforcing kingside defense without obstructing the queen's diagonal. It's a subtle repositioning, aiming for central influence while keeping flexibility for future plans. This pawn advance, a6, subtly reinforces the queenside pawn chain, preparing for a potential queenside pawn break or simply dissuading white's knight from venturing towards b5. It's a measured step that prioritizes structural integrity over immediate aggression, a hallmark of patient positional play. Repositioning the knight to the kingside offers greater influence on the central dark squares, potentially preparing for a kingside pawn storm or reinforcing the kingside defense. Opening the d-file offers immediate prospects for your rook, potentially targeting white's king's Indian setup, but be mindful of the ensuing pawn structure and the central tension this decision creates. Reclaiming the central pawn and opening a diagonal for the queen creates immediate pressure on black's queenside. White gains valuable space and prepares for an active piece deployment, aiming to exploit the somewhat cramped position of black's knights. The bishop now eyes the a7-g1 diagonal, a subtle threat to consider. Invigorating the knight to e5 injects immediate dynamism into black's position, aiming to disrupt white's central control and open attacking avenues. This outpost could become a powerful piece, eyeing weaknesses around white's king, while simultaneously creating pressure on the d3 square and influencing the d4 pawn. Bringing the bishop back to e2 is a rather passive repositioning, sacrificing the tempo gained by recapturing on d4 and seemingly resigning the central pawns to black's control. This offers black a clear path to develop their queenside further and potentially exert pressure on the d4 pawn, which now appears less adequately defended. It suggests white is content to play a more cramped position, perhaps aiming for a slower, strategic battle where they can patiently build up counterplay. However, the immediate danger is that black's pieces, especially the knight on e5 and the potential bishop on g7, could become quite active, exploiting white's slightly cramped and less dynamic setup. Developing the bishop to this outpost on e6 aims to challenge white's central control and potentially create attacking opportunities on the kingside, hinting at a long-term plan to reroute the knight to a more active square like g6 or f5. clearing the e-file for potential rook activity, while simultaneously eyeing the weak f7 square, presents a fascinating strategic dilemma for black's king. Unlocking the queen side, this thrust challenges white's central grip and aims to create dynamic counterplay along the flank, potentially opening lines for the rook and queen. Shattering the central pawn structure now offers white a potential initiative, forcing black to reevaluate their piece placement and consider the open files that might emerge. Seizing the open file opens up a can of worms for white's rook, potentially creating long-term pressure along the file. Seizing the opportunity, white materializes a decisive pawn gain, disrupting black's central ambitions and opening lines for potential tactical onslaughts. Challenging the central pawn structure with this knight exchange immediately livens up the position, forcing white to consider pawn weaknesses on the queen side, while black seeks to exploit the temporary lack of a defender on the d4 square. The pawn recaptures, immediately contesting the open file and creating an unbalanced pawn structure, forcing a strategic reevaluation of piece deployment. Reclaiming the pawn and centralizing the bishop, black initiates a dynamic exchange that promises to open lines and potentially disrupt white's kingside pawn structure. This recapture is a pivotal moment, forcing white to decide whether to maintain their central pawn presence or engage in further exchanges. The ensuing material balance and pawn structure will heavily influence the character of the game moving forward, with black aiming to exploit any lingering weaknesses in white's position. Developing the queenside structure with an eye on controlling the open file. Recognizing the pawn chain and the blocked central pawns, black wisely opts to reinforce the kingside structure with this seemingly modest pawn advance, preparing to solidify the defense of the e6 square and potentially open lines for counterplay down the c-file if the opportunity arises. Castling kingside solidifies the monarch behind a robust pawn shield, simultaneously activating the rook for potential central ingress or supporting flank pressure on the kingside. An aggressive gambit emerges, sacrificing a pawn to ignite activity on the kingside and disrupt white's central pawn structure. Repositioning the knight towards the kingside, this maneuver anticipates a potential kingside attack for black, seeking to reinforce the kingside pawn structure and perhaps prepare for kingside castling or a more active knight roll. Rethinking piece placement, black channels their rook to the open c-file, a crucial artery now that white's pawn chain has fractured. This repositions a piece from a passive defensive post to an active attacking one, potentially pinning down the b2 pawn and creating future pressure on white's queenside structure. Opening up the c-file for potential infiltration, white aims to exploit the centralized nature of black's knight and potentially activate the rook. A bold foray into enemy territory, this knight's advance injects immediate tactical complexity, aiming to exploit white's slightly awkward piece placement and perhaps stir up trouble around the uncastled king. Slamming open the bishop pair is a bold decision here, gambling on tactical fireworks over positional stability. You're inviting a direct confrontation, hoping to exploit any loose pieces or open lines that arise from the ensuing skirmish. Consider how this exchange reshapes the pawn structure and potentially exposes both kings to more immediate threats. Think about who benefits more from the simplified position and whether this clears the path for any future pawn advancements or thematic attacks. Reclaiming the queen to a central outpost, black immediately challenges white's bishop placement and probes the queenside structure, preparing to exploit the open file for potential pressure on the d4 pawn. Harnessing the newly opened c-file, white asserts dominance, aiming to exploit the potential weakness on the queenside and pin down black's active queenside pieces. The queen abandons the dangerous but potentially influential central square, repositioning to a6 where it exerts pressure along the file and eyes potential breakthroughs on the queenside, while the knight on c4 becomes a more precarious piece awaiting support or withdrawal. Initiating a rook exchange simplifies the position while simultaneously opening the c-file for potential future action. This strategic decision forces black to confront the consequences of a potentially weakened pawn structure after recapture, and it also aims to reduce black's attacking potential on the queen side. The goal is to transition into a more manageable middle game or even an endgame where white's pieces might find better coordination. Reclaiming the rook immediately on the open file solidifies black's control of the vital c-file, creating a more dynamic endgame scenario, where both sides must navigate their remaining pieces carefully to exploit any weaknesses. Reasserting central influence becomes the priority as the knight embarks on a journey back to potentially contest the d5 square and bring pressure to bear on black's queenside pawns. An intriguing positional maneuver, this bishop finds a new home on c4, eyeing the now undefended a2 pawn and potentially disrupting white's queenside control. The long-term goal might be to exert pressure along the semi-open c-file, or perhaps it's a preparatory step for further piece redistribution as white's knights struggle to coordinate effectively. This retreat also frees up the d5 pawn, hinting at future pawn breaks for black. Unleashing a pawn thrust like f4 in this position, with the queens off the board and black's knight comfortably ensconced on c4, appears to be a rather premature and potentially weakening assault on white's kingside. It disrupts the pawn structure in front of the king without immediate tactical justification, creating a potential target for black's active pieces, particularly the knight that now eyes squares like e3 or g3. The central tension hasn't been fully resolved, and pushing this pawn might just open up more lines for black to exploit before white's own pieces are adequately coordinated to benefit from the aggressive pawn advance. Opening the d-file creates immediate complications, forcing white to reevaluate their central structure and potential king safety as black's pieces flood towards the contested territory. Sensing an opportunity, white advances the bishop to d4, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses around the king. This aggressive repositioning immediately challenges black's central control and forces a decision about how to address the looming threat. Executing a pawn exchange deep into enemy territory, this maneuver seeks to unravel white's pawn structure and liberate black's pieces for active engagement, aiming to exploit the now open diagonal and potentially create lasting weaknesses for the opponent's king. Securing the d-file for your rook, this queen sacrifice fundamentally alters the game's complexion, steering it toward a decisive pawn race where your connected passed kingside pawns, now unhindered, pose a significant threat to black's weakened monarch. The queen retreats to a more protected square, seeking to regroup after the exchanges, but this maneuver sacrifices central influence and delays bringing more pieces into the fray. Sharpening the tactical edge, white prepares to exploit the newly opened c-file, aiming to pressure black's position and potentially create attacking opportunities on the queen side, as the rooks are now poised for more dynamic action and a potential penetration of enemy territory. Reactivating the bishop to a6 achieves a vital coordination of black's pieces, aiming to exploit the semi-open c-file and create pressure on white's queenside structure. Preparing to contest the open d-file, white aims to initiate an exchange that might simplify into a more favorable structure or grant greater activity for the remaining pieces. A bold maneuver, aiming to disrupt white's potentially dominant rook on the c-file and inject some life into black's position by activating the rook and potentially creating counterplay along the fourth rank. Redirecting the rook to the second rank initiates a subtle but critical strategic maneuver, aiming to support the advance of the f-pawn and potentially create an outpost for the knight on e3. This action isn't about immediate aggression, but rather about building positional pressure and reinforcing key squares, anticipating black's attempts to activate their remaining pieces and exploit open lines. A daring gambit to disrupt white's queenside structure, sacrificing a piece for active counterplay and opening lines that were previously shut down by the knight's placement.